I crossed the Bridge of Lions just as the sun began to climb, its reflection scattered across the Matanzas River. The Memorial Day weekend always pulled me toward the cottage on Anastasia Island. That house had been my sanctuary for over 2 decades, a place where the sound of waves steadied my thoughts and the salty air made me feel alive again. I carried my small bag and the familiar jingling of keys, expecting nothing more than peace. But when I stepped onto the sandy walkway that led to my front porch, the sight stopped me cold. 3 unfamiliar cars were crammed into the yard, their tires sinking into the grass I had tended with my own hands. Children's shrieks carried over the sound of music blaring from the open windows. Towels were strewn across my wicker chairs, damp and stained with sand. It looked less like my cottage and more like a public beach house taken over for a holiday party. Karina appeared at the doorway, her frame blocking my entrance. She wore my blue apron, the one I had embroidered with tiny seashells years ago, as though it belonged to her. Her eyes narrowed with the kind of disdain that had grown sharper since the day she married my son. Why did that old parasite show up? Here? We have no room for you. Her words cut through the air, louder than the music, and for a moment it felt as if every voice, every sound, stopped to listen. Brennan stood just behind her, one hand resting on the doorframe. He didn't look at me directly. His gaze slipped toward the ground, shoulders drawn in as if he could make himself disappear. Not a word came from him. I steadied the keys in my hand, their weight trembling slightly against my palm. The humiliation rose hot in my chest, but I would not give them the satisfaction of a scene. My eyes swept past Karina, over the unfamiliar. Faces inside, the smoke curling from the balcony, the stains of disorder that spread across what had once been my calm retreat. I let a smile touch my lips, one I knew didn't reach my eyes. "It's okay, dear," I said softly, stepping back from the doorway. I turned toward the road, the music still echoing behind me, already knowing I would need to see more before I truly understood what had taken place inside my home. I lingered at the edge of the porch long enough to see what I had once cherished, now treated like a public playground. The geraniums I had nursed through storms and salt spray were battered under the feet of children kicking a rubber ball. There, laughter sharp against the thud of petals crushed on the stone path on the balcony above. A heavy-set man leaned against the railing, a cigarette drooping from his lips. Smoke drifted over the salt air, mixing into something sour through the open kitchen door. The sizzle of something burning met my nose. A pan was left untended while 2 women argued over seasoning, their voices rising as if they owned the space. The tile floor, which I had scrubbed and polished countless times, was strewn with muddy prints. My apron, still tied around Karina's waist, flapped as she moved between them, smiling like a hostess. One of her cousins, I later learned, whispered, loud enough for me to hear, "That's the famous seamstress. I thought she'd look more impressive." A few others chuckled, their eyes sweeping over my plain cotton dress and travel shoes. I felt every laugh like a pin pressed into my skin, but I kept my back straight. It was then I noticed Captain Reeves across the street. Standing by his gate, his years in the Coast Guard showed in the way he carried himself. Alert and steady, he caught my eye and mouthed, "You okay?" For the briefest second, I wanted to lift my hand to signal for help, but pride held me still. I gave a slow shake of my head. "Not now." Karina glanced over her shoulder as if she had caught the exchange. Her smirk deepened. The message was clear. This was her stage now, and I was nothing more than an unwanted guest. I stepped off the porch, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. I didn't argue, didn't demand, didn't beg. My silence was my shield. The path back to the main road stretched long, the heat rising off the asphalt as I walked toward town. By the time I reached the modest inn along A1A, I had already made up my mind. Tomorrow I would return not to fight, with raised voice, but to see, to listen, and to gather what I needed. The motel room was small, its walls painted a dull beige that seemed to swallow the light. But it gave me something I hadn't felt since stepping onto my own porch: control. I set my bag on the bed, pulled out my phone, and began uploading the photos I had taken. Each image carried its own wound. The cars parked like invaders across my lawn, the children trampling the flowers I had coaxed through years of storms, the smoke curling from a cigarette on my balcony. I made sure every detail was stored safely, in the cloud. If they thought my silence meant surrender, they hadn't learned who I was. From my purse, I pulled out a leather-bound journal, its edges worn from years of use. I wrote down each license plate, cross-checking the letters and numbers twice. Then I jotted the overheard words, "Parasite, ordinary, no room," and the exact time Karina had shouted them. My handwriting pressed hard into the paper, leaving indents, even on the next page. Evidence, I reminded myself. Not rage, not tears, evidence. When my hands began to shake, I reached into the pocket of my wallet and drew out a faded Polaroid. The picture showed Brennan at 20, his hair longer then, a streak of paint across his cheek. He stood beside me in the sunlight as we brushed cream-colored stucco onto the cottage's walls. He had smiled at me that day, saying, "Mom, this house is proof we made it." I traced the outline of that younger boy's face with my thumb, wondering how that same boy had grown into a man who stood silent while his wife called me a parasite. I slipped the photo back into the wallet and closed my eyes. The ache in my chest burned, but beneath it, something colder stirred. My smile on the porch had not been a mask of defeat. It was a strategy. They thought I had retreated, but I was only regrouping. At dawn, I would return. I would ask to retrieve a bottle of medicine and perhaps a few clothes. Nothing more. While inside, I would look for what I suspected was already true. Papers, notes, anything to confirm the feeling that this was not a spontaneous invasion, but something carefully arranged. I set my alarm for 5 and placed the journal on the nightstand, my pen resting across the page. I would walk back into that house, not as a guest, but as a witness to what was unfolding behind my own doors. When I was 42, the world collapsed around me. My husband's heart gave out in his sleep, and with him went the stability I had relied on. Brennan was just finishing high school. Wide-eyed and restless, I had nothing to fall back on but the skill of my hands. I rented a narrow storefront off St. George Street in downtown St. Augustine, where tourists strolled past with cameras and sun hats. Behind the window display of fabric bolts and lace trim, I worked late into the night, stitching gowns for weddings, hemming uniforms for the parochial school, patching shirts for men who could not afford replacements. Each dollar went into an envelope I labeled Anastasia. That word was more than a place. It was a promise that one day we would have a corner of the world untouched by loss. 2 years later, a hurricane swept the Florida coast. Houses along Anastasia Island stood broken, roofs torn, windows gutted by wind. Where others saw ruin, I saw a chance. I bought a small plot of storm-carred land, cheap because no one wanted to risk rebuilding so close to the water. I hired a contractor for the frame, but did the rest with my own hands. I studied how to reinforce beams with hurricane straps, how to lay tile so it wouldn't shift under salt air, and how to plant sea grapes that would anchor the sand. Every weekend Brennan came with me, carrying buckets of paint, handing me tools, laughing as we argued about where the windows should face. I still see him in my memory, 20 years old, standing on the half-finished porch with paint across his cheek. "Mom, this house is proof we made it," he told me. His voice had been proud, full of the certainty only youth can muster. I had believed him then. I had believed in us. That memory lingered like a ghost as I stood once more at the door of that same house. Karina's sister, a woman I barely knew, opened it with irritation. "You can get your medicine," she muttered, stepping aside as though she were doing me a favor. I crossed the threshold, the air heavy with scents that did not belong. To me, Cheap cologne, fried food, cigarette smoke. The walls felt close, unfamiliar, stripped of the care I had poured into them. It was as if the house itself no longer recognized me. My footsteps echoed across tile dulled with grime, and I braced myself for what I would find upstairs. I climbed the stairs with deliberate calm, though my chest tightened with each step. The house no longer sounded like mine. Instead of the familiar creak of wood and the distant hush of waves through open shutters, there was the murmur of unfamiliar voices, the shuffle of careless feet, and the faint hum of a television left too loud in the wrong room. When I pushed open the door to my bedroom, the air left my lungs. My clothes were stuffed into black garbage bags, stacked in the corner like donations, waiting for a pickup truck. 2 children I didn't recognize sprawled across my bed, tangled in the quilt I had sewn by hand after Brennan left for college. They slept heavily, oblivious, their sneakers still on, leaving streaks of sand against the fabric. The bathroom door was ajar. I stepped inside and recoiled at the sight of black hair dye streaked down the porcelain of the sink. My towels, once white with blue embroidery, were balled in the corner, stained beyond saving. It was like walking into the shell of a home, gutted and used by strangers. I steadied my hand, pulled my phone from my purse, and began to photograph. Everything. The bags, the bed, the dye-stained sink. Each picture felt like a stitch, threading together proof of what had been done. My hands trembled, but I forced them still. Drawers were half open, contents spilled. I reached for the small, velvet box where I kept my mother's pearl earrings and the gold watch my husband wore every day of our married life. The box lay on its side, empty. My breath caught, and I leaned on the dresser for balance. Those pieces were not just jewelry. They were the last tangible threads tying me to the people who had once held me steady. Now they were gone, stripped, from me as easily as the apron from the kitchen. I moved toward the closet, heart pounding behind the row of dresses. I had a cubby built into the wall. Few people knew of it, not even Brennan, until much later. Inside, I stored documents too important to keep in plain sight. My fingers found the latch, and I opened it, expecting the comfort of neat files. Instead, I pulled out a document I had never seen before, a physician's report on official letterhead, stamped and signed. The words blurred for a moment, but I forced myself to focus. It claimed I suffered from diminished capacity, that my age and health rendered me incapable of managing property. A coldness settled in my stomach. I had never been examined by this doctor. I had never signed a release. My name had been twisted into an argument against me. On the vanity counter nearby, a notepad sat open. The handwriting was Karina's, the loops and flourishes I had seen on birthday cards for the children. At the top of the page was a name I didn't recognize at first, then understood with clarity: a local attorney. Notes in the margin read, "Transfer. Deed and capacity claim." I slipped the report and the notepad into my bag, my pulse steadying with purpose. This was no misunderstanding. It was a plan. I turned toward the door, already knowing I would need allies beyond my own strength. Next morning, I drove up US Highway 1, the sun rising sharp against my windshield. My hands clutched the steering wheel tighter than I realized, the stolen documents and notepad sitting in my purse beside me like heavy stones. I stopped first at the bank, a place where I had walked through the doors so many times that the tellers knew me by name. The manager, Mr. Wilcox, greeted me with a concerned expression. After I explained what I needed, I asked for a letter confirming my decades of managing accounts without assistance. He didn't ask many questions, only raised his eyebrows when I mentioned a fraudulent claim of diminished capacity. Within minutes, he printed the document on official letterhead and signed it. He handed it across the desk as though passing me a shield. "No one can argue with this," he said. I thanked him, slipping the paper into my folder with a sense of gathering armor. From there, I drove north to Jacksonville, the road humming under my tires as I rehearsed what I would say. The attorney recommended by a colleague of Captain Reeves had a reputation for being both sharp and relentless. When I met Nia Hightower, she was exactly that. Tall, poised, with eyes that seemed to measure everything at once. I laid the photos, the fraudulent report, and the notepad across her polished desk. She listened quietly, her pen moving swiftly, across a legal pad. After a long pause, she looked up. "Mrs. Calder, what your daughter-in-law is attempting is not only cruel but criminal." She outlined a strategy with crisp precision. First, we would file an owner's affidavit with the county, sheriff seeking expedited removal of unlawful occupants. Second, a police report would document the missing pearls in the watch. Third, a formal complaint to the state medical board would address the false capacity letter exposing the doctor who had signed it. Finally, she would petition the court for a temporary injunction to block any further attempts to interfere with my property. It was a roadmap, clear and formidable. For the first time in days, I felt like the ground was steady beneath me. Yet Nia did not let me leave without a warning. "Fast relief is possible," she said, her voice firm. "But you need to understand this. Once we move forward, there's no going back. These ties, already frayed, will not mend easily. You may recover your home, but you will lose your son's loyalty forever." Her words settled like lead, but I nodded. He chose his side the moment he stayed silent. I signed the retainer agreement, placed my pen carefully back in my bag, and prepared myself for the next step. The law would speak where my voice had been. Dismissed. Tuesday morning broke hot and heavy, the kind of Florida heat that clings to your skin before the day has even started. I parked behind Nia's car and watched as 2 deputies stepped out of their cruiser, body cameras blinking red. A locksmith rolled a small case of tools, and the process server carried a folder thick with papers. My stomach tightened, but I steadied myself. Karina was already on the porch when we approached, her voice shrill. "My husband gave me permission," she shouted, pointing at me as if I were the intruder. Children pressed their faces to the window behind her, their eyes wide. Nia moved forward with unshakable calm, handing one deputy the deed with my name clearly stamped across it, followed by recent tax receipts and the sworn affidavit. "Mrs. Calder is the sole legal owner," she said. "These individuals are here without consent." The deputies walked through the house, noting damages and photographing what matched the theft report. In the kitchen, one lifted an empty jewelry box. In the living room, another pointed out broken drawers and scattered mail. Each detail built the case brick by brick. 10 minutes later, Brennan pulled up, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes darting everywhere, but toward mine. "Mom," he said, the word thin as though it belonged to someone else. I pulled the forged positions report and Karina's notepad from my bag and placed them in his hands. His face drained of color. "She's confused," Karina snapped, gripping his arm. "Tell them she misunderstood for the first time." Brennan pulled away. "Enough, Karina," he muttered, his voice shaking but clear enough for everyone to hear. The deputies did their work with quiet efficiency, instructing Karina's relatives to gather their things. Suitcases thumped down the porch steps, children cried, and neighbors leaned over their fences. Whispering, I stood at the gate, steady. As the locksmith replaced the lock and handed me the new keys, the cottage was mine again, though the weight of what it had cost pressed harder than the heat on my shoulders. By the end of the week, the sheriff's office had my theft report on file, and the deputies assured me the investigation was active. Late one evening, Karina's sister appeared at my gate, her face pale and drawn. Without a word, she pressed a small velvet pouch into my hand. Inside were my mother's pearls, returned as if secrecy could erase the theft. I thanked her, though not for the favor, only for restoring what should never have been taken. The clinic inquiry began almost immediately after Nia filed the complaint. The medical board requested my statement, and I provided every detail of the false report. The signature of a doctor I had never met, the clear attempt to label me incompetent. Knowing the system was looking into it gave me a steadier breath. Though I knew the process would be long, Brennan came alone 2 days later. He stood at the foot of the porch, hands jammed into his pockets, eyes darting between me and the ground. "Mom, we can work this out. No lawyers, no police, just family." His voice cracked on the word family. I listened, then told him the truth. Family was not defined by blood alone, but by care, respect, and responsibility. He had chosen silence when his voice mattered most. I would not undo the steps already taken. I explained that the cottage was now placed in a trust, with its future belonging to a scholarship fund and a sea turtle rescue program. His shoulders slumped, and he left without another word. The days that followed were filled with repairs. New locks, cameras along the eaves, hurricane shutters fitted tight against the salt wind. Captain Reeves helped me replant the geraniums, his steady hands pushing soil back into place, as if to remind me that roots can be set again. The house stood quieter now, not as it once was, but stronger. Defined by clear lines no one could cross, I sat on the porch each evening, certain of one truth: I had paid dearly for peace. But peace earned through boundaries was the only kind that lasted. Evenings on Anastasia Island carry their own rhythm. I sat on the deck as the sky dimmed to a soft violet, pelicans gliding low across the Matanzas Inlet, their wings just grazing the water. The air smelled of salt and seagrass, clean again the way it had when I first built this place. A letter arrived that morning, Brennan's handwriting uneven across the envelope. I opened it slowly, reading the words twice to be sure of them. He apologized for how it looked, as if the betrayal were only a matter of appearances. There was no mention of the forged documents, the silence that cut deeper than Karina's insults, or the stolen heirlooms. His words reached for absolution without ever touching truth. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer by my chair. I had no answer to give. The porch light glowed beside me, casting a warm circle across the deck. I left it on each night now, not as a beacon for anyone else, but as a promise to myself. It shone over the geraniums I had replanted, over the shutters reinforced against storms, over the walls that carried the weight of my labor and loss. I leaned back, letting the sound of the tide fill the silence. The water moved with certainty, retreating only to return again. Steady as breath, strength could be that way too. Quiet, constant, unshaken by the noise around it. Never mistake age for weakness. Quiet is a choice, not surrender. And tomorrow, when the tide came in again, it would not wash away what I had endured. It would bring back only what was deserved, whether regret or respect.